My name is Rachel Ainsley, and I'm 41 years old. At my son Noah's high school graduation party in my in-law's backyard in Naperville, Illinois, my mother-in-law stood up with a glass of champagne in front of 60 guests and said, "Let's be honest, she's not his real mother. Blood is blood." My husband Marcus didn't hesitate. He stood, looked straight at her, and said one sentence that made her lower her glass and made 3 of her friends set theirs down entirely. What none of them knew was that this wasn't the beginning of a family argument. It was the moment 11 years of quiet, carefully hidden cruelty finally came due. I raised Noah from the time he was 6 years old. I am not, and have never pretended to be, his biological mother. His mother, Marcus's first wife Elaine, died in a car accident when Noah was 4. I met Marcus 2 years later, when Noah was a shy first grader who still slept with a nightlight shaped like a fire truck. I didn't try to replace anyone. I never once told him to call me Mom. He started doing that on his own, 3 years into our marriage, on a random Tuesday over pancakes, like it was the easiest decision he'd ever made. I cried in the bathroom afterwards so he wouldn't see. Marcus's mother, Diane Ainsley, never accepted it. Not once, not for a single day of the 11 years I've known her. She has a particular way of saying Noah's real family at holidays, a particular way of directing every photo request toward blood relatives only, a particular way of looking at me across a dinner table like I'm a competent but ultimately replaceable employee who happens to also share a bed with her son. I told myself for years that this was simply grief wearing the costume of cruelty, that Diane had lost a daughter-in-law she loved, and I was a reminder that life had moved on without permission. I gave her grace for over a decade. I made her son's favorite meals at every holiday she hosted. I sent her flowers on Elaine's birthday every year without being asked, because I understood that grief doesn't come with an expiration date, and I never wanted Noah to think loving me meant forgetting his mother. What I didn't understand, until 3 weeks before the graduation party, was that Diane hadn't spent 11 years grieving. She'd spent 11 years building a case. It started, as these things always seem to, with something small. Noah had been accepted to Northwestern with a partial academic scholarship, and the remaining tuition gap was going to be covered by a trust that Elaine's parents, Noah's biological grandparents, had set up before they passed away, years before I ever entered the picture. Marcus had always managed the trust's paperwork with a lawyer named Priya Chandrasekaran, a woman I'd met exactly twice in 11 years, always briefly, always in passing. 3 weeks before graduation, Marcus came home from a meeting with Priya looking like a man who had aged 5 years in one afternoon. He didn't say anything at dinner. He didn't say anything while we did the dishes. He waited until Noah had gone up to his room, and then he sat down across from me at the kitchen table and set a manila folder down between us. The way you set something down when you've been carrying it somewhere private in your chest for hours and your arms have finally given out. "My mother submitted a formal request to Priya," he said, "to be added as a co-trustee on Noah's education fund. She used the phrase blood guardian in the paperwork. I didn't understand at first. She wants to help pay for school." "No," Marcus said. "She wants control over how the money is spent. And in her request, she specifically asked Priya to note that you should have no decision-making authority because you are, and I'm quoting the document directly, not a blood relative of the beneficiary." I sat very still, the way you sit when you're trying to figure out whether you actually heard something correctly or whether your mind invented it out of exhaustion. "She wrote that down, on paper." "She wrote it down," Marcus said, "and she had it notarized. I want to be honest about something. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from confirming a cruelty you already suspected, and it's different from the shock of discovering one you never saw coming. This was the first kind. I had felt Diane's coldness toward me for 11 years the way you feel a draft under a door, persistent, uncomfortable, but survivable, because I told myself it was just temperature, not intention. Now I was holding paperwork that proved it had never been a draft. It had been a plan. I didn't cry. I remember being surprised by that, sitting at my own kitchen table with my hands flat against the wood, feeling something colder than sadness settle into my chest. Marcus reached across and put his hand over mine. "I told Priya no," he said. "Immediately. She's not getting anywhere near that trust. But Rachel, there's more, and I need you to see it before I say anything else." He opened the folder. Inside was a printed email chain between Diane and a family law attorney named Gregory Voss, spanning nearly 8 months. The subject line of the first email read, Grandparent rights inquiry, non-biological stepmother situation. I read through 11 pages of correspondence in which my mother-in-law had methodically inquired about the legal standing of stepparents in Illinois, asked pointed questions about whether a non-blood stepmother could be excluded from medical decision-making if something happened to her son, and in an email dated just 6 weeks earlier, asked directly whether it would be possible to petition for partial custody rights over Noah in the event of a marital separation, listing herself as an alternative guardian. "She's been planning for us to get divorced," I said slowly. "For 8 months. She's been planning for you to be removed," Marcus said. Divorce was just the mechanism she was hoping for. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Removed. Like I was a fixture that had outlived its usefulness. Like 11 years of packed lunches and midnight fevers and driving lessons and prom photos and a boy who called me mom over pancakes on a random Tuesday had all been provisional, pending Diane's approval, which she had apparently decided, quietly, in a lawyer's office was never coming. "Why now?" I asked. "Why the trust? Why the lawyer? Why after all this time?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "Because Noah's turning 18 in 4 months. Once he's an adult, she loses her last legal argument for having any say in his life at all. This is her last window." I thought about all the years I'd given her grace, all the flowers on Elaine's birthday, all the holiday dinners where I'd bitten my tongue through comments about real family, because I told myself grief deserved patience. I had spent 11 years extending kindness to a woman who had spent the same 11 years quietly building a legal case for my erasure. "What do we do?" I asked. Marcus looked at me with an expression I'd only seen once before, the week Elaine died, when he'd had to explain to a 4-year-old why his mother wasn't coming home. It was the look of a man who had run out of patience for gentleness. "We let her think she's still winning," he said. "Right up until the moment she isn't. The next 3 weeks, I lived 2 lives, the way you sometimes have to when the truth arrives faster than you're ready to act on it. In one life, I was the daughter-in-law who still sent Diane a birthday card, who still asked about her garden, who still smiled through comments about real grandchildren at the monthly family dinners she insisted on hosting. In the other life, I sat up after Noah and Marcus were asleep, going through 11 years of memory with new eyes, finding the cracks I had trained myself not to see. I remembered the Christmas when Noah was 9, and Diane had given every blood grandchild a savings bond and given Noah a coloring book. I remembered thinking at the time that it was thoughtless rather than deliberate. I remembered it differently now. I remembered the photo wall in Diane's living room, updated every year at Thanksgiving, always arranged with painstaking care, and always, without fail, positioning me at the very edge of the frame, half-cropped, while Noah stood dead center beside his grandmother, as though the photographer's job was to slowly, patiently, over a decade, edit me out of the family picture one Thanksgiving at a time. I remembered Diane's oldest friend, a woman named Carol Whitfield, pulling me aside at a barbecue 4 years ago and saying apropos of nothing, "You know, it's remarkable how well you've handled being, well, second." And I remembered laughing it off because I didn't yet understand that Carol wasn't making an observation. She was relaying information she'd been given. Marcus, for his part, spent those 3 weeks doing what I now understood was his own version of building a file. He filed formal paperwork with Priya Chandrasekaran, removing his mother from any future consideration as a trustee, in writing, with legal language that could never again be quietly reopened. He requested and received full copies of every email Diane had exchanged with Gregory Voss, subpoenaed not by any court, but simply handed over by an attorney who, it turned out, had grown uneasy enough about his clients, requests that he was relieved to have an excuse to close the file entirely. "She wants me gone even if he told me something interesting," Marcus said to me one night, 2 weeks before graduation, sitting on the edge of our bed with his laptop open. "Voss said my mother asked him, more than once, whether there was any way to have you legally declared unfit to make medical decisions for Noah if something ever happened to me. Not because you'd done anything. Just because you weren't blood." I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as a kind of quiet, cold clarity, the same feeling I would learn later, that women like me describe again and again when the last piece of a puzzle finally slides into place and the picture becomes something you can no longer unsee. "Di," I said. "She wants you gone regardless of what happens to me," Marcus said. "That's what I needed you to understand. This was never about our marriage. This is about you specifically. She has spent 11 years deciding you don't belong in this family, and she has spent the last 8 months trying to make that decision legally permanent. I asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest for 3 weeks, the one I was almost afraid to say out loud. Does Noah know any of this? Marcus shook his head slowly. Not yet, but Rachel, he's not stupid. He's noticed things too. He asked me last month why Grandma never puts your name on the holiday cards she sends out. He's 18 in 4 months. He's not a child who needs to be protected from the truth anymore. He's a young man who deserves to see exactly who has been on his side and who has been playing a longer game. I didn't know, sitting on the edge of that bed, exactly what Marcus meant by the phrase, playing a longer game, or how deliberately he had already begun playing one of his own. I only knew that for the first time in 11 years, I wasn't the only person in that house who had stopped being surprised by Diane, and that surprised me more than anything. 3 days before the party, Marcus asked me a question that, in hindsight, I understand was the true beginning of everything that happened at that backyard gathering. How many years of texts do you think my mother has sent me? He asked, where she says something about you that she'd never say to your face. I didn't know the answer. Marcus did. He'd spent those 3 weeks quietly going back through 11 years of message history, and he had found, cataloged, and screenshotted 22 separate text messages in which his mother had referred to me, in writing, in language ranging from dismissive to openly cruel, calling me the placeholder, questioning aloud whether Noah would even remember his real mother the longer I stayed in his life, and in a message sent the week of Noah's 16th birthday, writing the sentence that Marcus would later read aloud, word for word, in front of 60 stunned guests. I don't understand why we're all pretending she's actually his mother. Blood is blood, and someday Noah is going to realize that too. He had saved every one of them, not out of paranoia, out of habit, the quiet, patient habit of a man who had spent years sensing something was wrong and had finally decided it was time to stop hoping he was mistaken. I'm not going to confront her before the party, he told me, the night before graduation. I want her to say it out loud, in front of everyone, the way she's clearly been building up the nerve to for years. I want her to think she's finally winning, and then I want everyone in that backyard to understand exactly what she's been saying about you in private the entire time she's been smiling at you in public. I looked at my husband, the boy I'd fallen for over pancakes and fire truck nightlights, the man who had built, without my knowledge, a quiet and devastating case for my own defense, and I understood that whatever happened at that graduation party the next day, I would not be walking into it alone. I still walked in nervous. I did not yet understand that I was walking in armed. The party started at 4 o'clock on a warm Saturday afternoon in Diane's backyard in Naperville. She'd rented a white tent, hired a small catering staff, and set up a table near the back porch with a banner that read "Congratulations, Noah," in gold script, 60 folding chairs, a cake with Northwestern's purple and white colors. Diane moved through the crowd in a cream-colored dress, greeting guests with the warm, practiced hospitality she'd perfected over 4 decades of hosting. The same warmth, I now understood, that had never once in 11 years been extended to me without an asterisk attached. Noah was radiant that afternoon, 18 years old and glowing with the particular joy of a boy who has just finished something hard and is about to start something new. He hugged me twice before the party even started, once in the kitchen while we were setting up, and once on the back porch, whispering, "Thanks for everything, Mom," into my shoulder in a voice too quiet for anyone else to hear. I held onto that hug longer than I probably should have. I didn't know yet how much I would need it later that day. Diane's sister, my aunt-in-law Patricia, cornered me near the drink table early in the party and asked, with the particular brightness people use when they already know the answer to a question, "Are you excited for him to go off to Northwestern? Must be strange, watching him become such a young man when you've only really known him since." She paused, smiling. "Well, since he was already so grown up." I smiled and said something about how proud I was. I had 11 years of practice smiling through exactly that kind of sentence. At 5:30, Diane tapped her champagne glass with a spoon and called for everyone's attention. Marcus, standing beside me near the back of the tent, went very still. I felt his hand find mine. "I want to say a few words about my grandson," Diane began, her voice carrying easily across the yard. She talked about Noah's childhood, about Elaine, about how proud his mother would have been to see him graduate. It was, for the first 90 seconds, exactly the kind of speech you'd expect, warm, sentimental, entirely appropriate. And then her eyes moved to me. "Of course," she said, her tone shifting into something lighter, almost conversational, the tone of a woman delivering what she believed was a harmless joke. We all know Rachel has done a lovely job helping raise him. But let's be honest tonight, since we're all family here, she's not his real mother. Blood is blood. And I think somewhere, wherever she is, Elaine would want us to remember that. The yard went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when a joke has landed wrong, and everyone is waiting to see if someone will laugh first to make it socially acceptable. A few people did 3, maybe 4 uncertain, scattered laughs, the kind people give when they're more uncomfortable with silence than with cruelty. I stood up. My hands were shaking, though I hadn't consciously decided to stand. 11 years of grace. 11 years of flowers on a dead woman's birthday. 11 years of biting my tongue through smaller versions of exactly this sentence. And here it finally was, delivered in full in front of 60 people at the one event that should have belonged entirely to Noah. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Marcus stood up beside me. He didn't raise his voice. He has never once in the 12 years I've known him needed to raise his voice to make a room understand he was serious. 22, he said, looking directly at his mother. Diane's smile flickered, uncertain. What? 22 text messages, Marcus said. Over 11 years where you've called Rachel a placeholder, questioned whether Noah would even remember his real mother as long as she stayed married to me. And this one's from his 16th birthday, Mom. I want to make sure I get it exactly right. Where you wrote, quote, I don't understand why we're all pretending she's actually his mother. Blood is blood, and someday Noah is going to realize that too. He took his phone out of his pocket. I have all 22 of them, he said. Would you like me to read the rest out loud, or would you like to sit down? Diane's champagne glass didn't shake, exactly, but her hand went very still around it, the way a hand goes still when a person is concentrating hard on not letting something drop. Patricia set her own glass down on the nearest table without seeming to notice she'd done it. 2 women near the front. I would later learn they were members of Diane's book club, women who had known her for over a decade, exchanged a glance and quietly stepped back from the small crowd gathered near the tent center pole. Marcus, Diane said, her voice thin, this isn't the place. You made it the place, Marcus said, when you decided to stand up at my son's graduation party and tell 60 people that the woman who raised him for 11 years isn't really his mother. So we're going to finish this conversation, Mom, right here, because I think everyone deserves to understand exactly what you've been saying about Rachel behind her back. This entire time you've been smiling at her to her face. Noah, standing near the cake table, had gone completely pale. He looked between his grandmother and his father, and then, slowly, he looked at me, not with confusion, but with something that looked almost like recognition, like a puzzle he'd sensed the shape of for years finally clicking into a picture he could see clearly. Grandma, he said quietly, is that true? Diane opened her mouth, closed it, looked around the yard at 60 faces that were, for the first time in 11 years, no longer looking at me with polite, careful blankness, but were instead looking at her. I have also, Marcus continued, his voice still even, still quiet, spoken with Priya Chandrasekaran about the request you filed to be added as a co-trustee on Noah's education fund, and about the emails you sent to Gregory Voss over the last 8 months asking whether Rachel could be legally excluded from medical decisions or custody rights in the event something happened to me. I have copies of all of it. A man near the back of the crowd, Diane's neighbor, a retired judge named Harold Prescott who had known her socially for nearly 20 years, set down his plate and said, quietly but audibly, Diane, is that true? You were planning legal action against your own daughter-in-law. Diane did not answer him. She was looking at Noah. Sweetheart, she started, I only ever wanted what was best for. Don't, Noah said. His voice cracked slightly, 18 years old and trying to sound like a man for the first time in front of 60 people. Don't say my name like that isn't what you meant. I heard you, Grandma. Blood is blood. That's what you think of her, after everything. He looked at me, and his eyes were wet, and he said, in a voice that broke something open in my chest that I don't think will ever fully close again, she's been my mother since I was 6 years old. She's the one who sat with me in the ER when I broke my arm in 4th grade because Dad was stuck in traffic. She's the one who taught me to drive. She's the one who stayed up with me the whole night before my SATs because I was too anxious to sleep. You sent me a coloring book for Christmas when I was 9 and gave my cousins savings bonds. I remember that, Grandma. I've always remembered that. The yard was utterly silent. Somewhere near the back, I heard someone quietly say, "Oh my God," under their breath. Diane's face had gone through several expressions in the space of 30 seconds: defensiveness, then something like panic, then finally something that looked almost like grief, though I no longer trusted myself to know whether it was grief for what she'd done or grief for having been caught doing it. "I loved my daughter-in-law," she said, quietly now, no longer performing for the crowd. "Elaine, I loved her so much, and when she died, I think some part of me decided that loving anyone else who took her place would be a kind of betrayal. I know that isn't fair. I know it isn't Rachel's fault. Her voice caught. I never let myself stop being angry that she wasn't here to see this, and it was easier to be angry at Rachel than to be angry at nothing at all. It was, I will admit, the most honest sentence I had ever heard Diane say in 11 years. It didn't undo the 22 messages. It didn't undo 8 months of legal inquiries into how to erase me from her grandson's life. But for one brief moment, standing in that backyard with 60 guests watching, I saw the woman underneath the campaign. A mother who had lost her daughter-in-law and had never once, in over a decade, found a way to grieve her without punishing the person who had simply tried to love the family that was left behind. I didn't forgive her that day. I want to be honest about that. Forgiveness, I've learned, is not something you can perform on command in front of an audience, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise simply because the moment called for a tidy resolution. But I did walk over to Noah. I put my hand on his shoulder and I said quietly, just for him, "I'm proud of you, today and every day. That's never once depended on blood." He hugged me, right there in front of everyone, and I felt something in my chest finally, fully exhale for the first time in 11 years. Marcus didn't yell at his mother. He didn't need to. He simply said, "Priya has already filed the paperwork removing you from any future involvement with Noah's trust. That was done 2 weeks ago, and it's permanent. What happens with the rest of this family going forward is up to you. But I want to be clear in front of everyone here that Rachel is not a placeholder, and she is not going anywhere. And if you want any relationship with your grandson going forward, that relationship is going to require you to finally accept that." We left 20 minutes later. Not because the party was ruined. Noah insisted, through tears, that he still wanted his cake, still wanted his photos, still wanted the day to belong to him and not to his grandmother's confession. But because Diane, quietly, asked for time alone to sit with what had happened, and Marcus, with more grace than I think I could have managed in his position, gave it to her. In the weeks that followed, the consequences arrived the way they always seem to, not all at once, but in pieces. Diane's book club, I later learned, quietly stopped inviting her to 2 consecutive meetings. Harold Prescott, the retired judge, sent Marcus a short, formal note saying he'd been troubled enough by what he witnessed that he wanted to state, for the record, that he considered Marcus's handling of the matter appropriate and overdue. Patricia called me, awkwardly, 3 days later, to apologize for the "must be strange," watching him become such a young man comment, admitting she hadn't fully understood, until that afternoon, how long a pattern she'd been quietly participating in. Diane herself called twice in the following month. I didn't answer either time. Marcus spoke with her once, briefly, and reported back only that she had asked, for the first time in 11 years, what my favorite flower was. I don't know yet what our relationship will become. I know that 11 years of quiet cruelty doesn't dissolve because of one honest sentence in a backyard, however sincerely meant. But I also know something I didn't fully understand before that graduation party, that the family you build isn't always defined by the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's defined by the boy who calls you mom over pancakes on an ordinary Tuesday, and the husband who spends 3 quiet weeks building a case not for himself, but for you, simply because he refuses to let you spend 1 more year believing you don't belong. Noah leaves for Northwestern in 6 weeks. I've already started planning the drive up, already started imagining his dorm room, already crying a little every time I think about the fact that in 11 years, I never once needed blood to know exactly how much I loved him. If this touched something in you, a family that measured your belonging by lineage instead of love, a silence you mistook for peace, a toast or a speech that was meant, quietly, to make you disappear, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and let me know if you've ever had to stand in a room and finally hear the truth said out loud.